Good morning. Today I'm coming to you from our women's ministry Bible study classroom. This is Debbie Bolt's classroom, where she leads the women in our church, WMU, our ladies in Bible study on Sunday mornings. If you're a woman in our church and you are looking for a place, I want to encourage you to talk to Miss Debbie. You would definitely be blessed by getting to know her and serving alongside of her here in our women's ministry with all the other women that are in our church and that she leads. This morning we're going to be bringing our Bible study from Philippians chapter 2. We're going to be looking in chapter 2, starting in verses 1 through 5 and then skipping down to verse 13 through 15. And our Bible study this morning is really going to lead us to the mirror. We're really going to be asked today to take a look inside of each one of us. And so I want to challenge you to not cower away from that, but to be encouraged as you look inside and try to become more like Christ. And that's really what we're going to be talking about today. Now, Philippians was written by the Apostle Paul in AD 61, 62. He's writing while he's on house arrest. He's awaiting his first trial with the emperor, and he writes to the church in Philippi. And I wanted to start us off today as we're looking at this passage, and I want to ask you a question and get you to think about it. Have you ever waited in line? Actually went, stood, camped out even, wait in line to be the very first one to purchase something, maybe the latest iPhone or the latest techno gadget thing, Android phone, iPhone, something. Have you ever waited in line to be the first, or maybe some of you have braved the elements and gotten up real early on a Black Friday and ventured out to be the first one in line so that you could buy the next greatest thing at the sales prices, something to that effect. Maybe it's not to be first in line, but you chose to go last. You were noble and took the noble path and wanted to choose I won't go first, you go first. Maybe in a situation like, at the doctor and you and your family are there getting the flu shot. And so everybody else go first. No, you go first, I'll go last. Or maybe some of you more braver ones in our church that have gone skydiving. Maybe you're standing at the edge of that door looking down at the earth and you think, no, y'all go first, I'll go last, I'll wait to jump out of this perfectly good airplane. Ladies first. I don't know what it might be that you have chosen to go first in line, but the Apostle Paul is sharing with us in today's passage a time when Christians are expected to put something first. We're expected to go first. We're expected to place something first in our lives. And I want us to take a look today at this. If you'll look with me, we've been talking about relationships for the past several weeks. And this week we're looking at relationships as well, but it's from the perspective of placing other people first before our own interests. And that's what we're going to be looking at today. Look with me at Philippians chapter 2. We're going to read verses 1 through 4. I want to invite you to read those with me. Paul says, if therefore there is any encouragement in Christ, if there is any consolation of love, if there is any fellowship of spirit, if any affection and compassion, make my joy complete by being of the same mind, maintaining the same love, united in spirit, intent on one purpose. Verse 3, do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility of mind, let each of you regard one another as more important than himself. Do not merely look out for your own personal interest, but also for the interests of others. Isn't it funny how you can put toddlers, you can put babies in a room, and two toddlers can go into one of our nursery rooms full of toys, and they're all perfectly fine until that one child zones in on that one toy that he wants, and then all the other children want that exact same toy. It's almost as if all the other toys in the room disappear, and that's the only toy in sight. It's amazing how that happens, and how those toddlers, as they grow up to be adults, their approach to these situations might change a little bit. But how many adults sitting out here, how many of us still have this "it's mine" type attitude? Those words come to your they haunt you. They roll around in the back of your mind at times when something happens. Something's going on, and you think it's mine. Those types of things. It's amazing how many times those thoughts enter into our conversations. What about adults in business meetings here at church? We haven't had the opportunity to have church in a while, and those wonderful Baptist business meetings, where something is said, something's brought up, especially in churches, when you're talking about budgets and dollars and money, and something comes up, and people don't really have the same ideas as what's being shared, or they don't really agree with something in a line item budget. And yet the expectation is for us to show each other love and mercy, and to not lash out, and to not think selfishly in those situations. And that's really kind of what the Apostle Paul is leading us to in this understanding, that we're to put others first. We're to put them before ourselves. This sort of thing comes out a lot in different settings of different kinds. And Paul compares it to a self-centeredness, a selfishness, where we're more interested in what I want than what others want, and we put ourselves before other people. Paul is focused on, with the church of Philippi, he's focusing on really maintaining love and unity within the church. And he's telling them the one way to maintain love and unity is to put the other person first. And that's really what I want us to look at, and I believe what our Sunday school lesson is gearing us towards and pointing us to, is looking at how to make our relationships better by putting the other person first. So look at verses 3 and 4 again with me. Verses 3 and 4 say, "Do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility of mind, let each of you regard one another as more important than himself." And so again, we're told that no one is more important, that I'm not more important than you. That for me to put on the example that Christ expects of me, I'm to lay all my own wants and needs aside, and what others want and what others need is most important. And that's the focus that we want to look at today. And he's urging the church in Philippi and us today to think in those terms. And we know that because, again, all through this letter, and through what we've been looking at, Paul has been pointing us to look at Christ as our example. And if you think back, how did Christ live? At what point in his life here on earth did Jesus put himself first above all others? We'll talk about that here in a little bit. But Paul tells us that we're to model our lives after Jesus. And look at verse 5 with me. Verse 5 says that we're to have this attitude in yourselves, which was also in Christ Jesus. We're to adopt the same attitude that Jesus has, right? I mean, the Bible doesn't tell us that we're to adopt the same attitude as, maybe like our parents. We're to adopt the same attitude as teachers. For those of you that are in school, maybe adopt the same attitude as our peers, our friends. No, he doesn't tell us to do that. He tells us that we're to adopt the same attitude as Jesus. And if you look in verses 6 through 11, it shows us exactly what type of attitude Christ took. Christ took on this mode of putting others first, specifically put us first. And if you think about all the things that went on in Jesus' earthly life while he was here, did he put himself first when he chose the disciples? Did he think about who are the most influential people on the face of the planet? that I could go recruit as my first disciples? Did he choose those that were the most educated and most knowledgeable, most influential, that when they spoke, everyone would listen? No, he didn't choose those. He didn't put himself first there. Um, did he choose to put himself first when he was agonizing in the Garden of Gethsemane over what was to come, begging God that if there's any way to let this cup pass from me, that please God, let there be, is there any other way? He didn't put himself first there. He didn't make another path, another way out. Rather, what he did say at the end of that is, not my will, but yours, God. What about when he was actually arrested and taken and beaten? All the pain and the shame and the embarrassment that he suffered through just to get to the cross and then hanging on the cross. He didn't put himself first in any of those. And if you look at the life of Jesus, Jesus put us first because our needs were what was important at the time for what God was trying to do. God was working behind the scenes to make a way for you and I to be made right because of sin in our lives. And in order for that to happen, Jesus had to put himself second. He had to move himself and put us first and be willing to suffer in our place. And that's really one of the things that the Apostle Paul is wanting us to tie into and to recognize that even Jesus' life here on earth, he didn't put himself first. He put us first. He put others first, the needs of others first. And we're to have the same attitude. We're to do the exact same things as believers, as Christians, as followers of Jesus. So when you look at this, I was reminded of a movie I saw not too long ago. It's a movie called, this is an older movie. I'll probably date myself and talk about how old I am here. But this is a movie called Groundhog Day. It came out in 1993. I know some of you may not even have been born in 1993. But in 1993, Bill Murray starred in a movie called Groundhog Day. And in this movie, he plays a cynical weatherman who is sent to cover Groundhog Day. And he shows up in this little podunk village, this little podunk town. He's not happy to be there. He's just ready to do the story and get out. And a blizzard prevents him from leaving. And he has to spend the night there, and he's not real happy about it. He wakes up the next morning and almost in a really bad attitude, mocking the songs on the radio. And he goes downstairs from this bed and breakfast boarding house that he stayed in overnight, and he's really cynical to the lady who's welcoming him there and wishing him a good morning. And he's rude and he's crude and he's just not very polite, very sarcastic in his responses. And as he walks through town going to where this news story is supposed to take place, people are talking to him and meeting him and greeting him. And again, he's just very rude and crude. And the whole crux of the movie is every day, every morning, he wakes up and it's the same thing over again. He's reliving the same day all over again. And in the movie, things get worse before they get better. The character in the movie, his crudeness and his rudeness really grows to levels that would be unheard of. Probably in the movie, how they kind of lean, it's because, hey, there's no consequences. And so someone says, hey, good morning, and he hits him, or, stuff like that, just craziness in the movie. But as the character wakes up morning after morning after morning, reliving the same day over again, his character begins to soften, and he begins to befriend the people that he sees every morning. And he knows the conversations that are going to happen. He knows the people he's going to meet. And so he finds himself being very generous and very nice to them and helpful. And it's almost as if he makes this shift in his very own self. His very own attitude changes. And that shift in and of itself is really the kind of shift that we are being asked to make here by the Apostle Paul. Now, Jesus is a much better example of of the shift that we're to make than a movie character. And if you look on your own and read down in verses 6 through 11, you could see where Jesus demonstrates this attitude that we're to take on. And it's that attitude that he was willing to pay the ultimate price even, because putting the needs of others, us, before his own, provides us with the opportunity for salvation and to be made right with God. So since this expectation that Paul is laying out for us is to be more like Jesus, the question then is, well, how do we do that? How do we take on the same attitude as Jesus? In verse 5, we're told to adopt that same attitude. Well, how do we do that? Look down with me, if you will, at verse 13 and following. It says, "For it is God who is at work in you, both to will and to work for his good pleasure. Do all things without grumbling or disputing, that you may prove yourself to be blameless and innocent children of God, above reproach, in the midst of crooked and perverse generation, among whom you appear as lights in the world." Back in the 1700s, Jonathan Edwards was a preacher during the first Great Awakening, and sometime during the first that first 1730s, 1740s, Jonathan Edwards became a very famous revivalist preacher. He preached the sermon that many of you may be aware of or familiar with the title, called the Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And he served for a pastor of his church for over 23 years. And towards the end of his pastorate, that 23rd year, there were a lot of things that began to go on in the life of the church and in his own leadership, and way too much for a Sunday school lesson. But in a nutshell, he began to change his ideology, his way of thinking about who should take the Lord's Supper. And it created a problem in his church, and they ended up firing him, asking him to leave. And it's during this time where Jonathan Edwards, he's being fired. It's one of the hardest times for him in leading a pastorate, where he's wanting to lead in one direction, and the church is really just digging in and saying no. And there's a man in his church who is noted as saying, "I never saw the least symptoms of displeasure in his countenance the whole week, but he appeared like a man of God, whose happiness was out of reach of his enemies." Think about that for a minute. He's going through so much turmoil in his own church. And the people in his church, there's a lot of badgering going on. There's a lot of backstabbing, a lot of ugliness going on around him. And this one man writes down and observes what's happening. And he's not commenting on the events or the actions that are happening. He's commenting on the countenance of Jonathan Edwards. He's commenting on how Jonathan Edwards is responding to what's happening. And again, he says, "I never saw the least symptoms of displeasure in his countenance the whole week, but he appeared like a man of God, whose happiness was out of reach of his enemies." And that's what God is asking us to do. That's what Paul is challenging us. It's to rise above. Kind of like an airplane that can rise above and fly above the turbulence that's going on in the air. We're to rise above the turbulence going on in the circumstances of our lives, just like Jonathan Edwards did. We're to take the high road. We are to change our reactions to what's happening around us. If you think about it, the world is full of whiners. People who whine all the time. People who are haters. They always talk about the bad things. Critics, maybe even cynics. The world is full of these people. And Christian brothers and sisters, Paul is challenging you and I to rise above that, like a plane flying above the turbulence. And we are to be that breath of fresh air that the world is so desperately in need of. So let me ask you this question. How do we do this? How do we rise above the grumbling, the complaining, the arguing, the constant griping that comes about in our own lives, our own homes, our own workplaces, our own church? How do we do that? Um, if you look at what Paul is saying here, Paul says that he is convinced that God is up to something greater. He's at work behind the scenes. And it's because we know God is at work in the situations around us that you and I can rise above what's happening to us. We don't have to really, join in with everybody and have a pity party. We don't have to join in and start whining about our circumstances and griping about them and complaining. We can rise above that as we look to God, knowing that God's hand is at work. God is doing something here. So let's look above that. Let's look beyond that. One of the things I want to challenge you to say, some of you might look at this video and say, Tim, what you're saying that this Sunday school lesson is talking about sounds easy, but it's really challenging. That's very difficult. And trust me, I believe I would say that with you. It is very hard to take the high road. But again, if you look at what God has called us to do, God has not called us to live a mediocre life. He's not called us to live as the world lives. He's called us to live as Jesus modeled for us. And that is a very high standard. So let's think about a few situations. I always want to stop and think about, if we could create our own anti-grumbling scenario. We got to think about it before it happens, right? If you just sit back and wait until somebody pushes your buttons to think about how you're going to respond to that, you might not respond correctly. So let's think ahead of that. Let's choose something, that happens a whole lot in this area where we live. Maybe somebody cuts you off in traffic, right? They cut out in front of you in your car, and they cut you off. How do you respond to that? Do you have a conversation with them through your windshield? Do you pound on your steering wheel? Do you blare your horn? What do you do? Do you audibly speak out loud, whether you're with anyone or not, and voice your displeasure at the fact that car thought they were gracious enough and they thought they deserved the road in front of you? How do you respond in that situation? What does it do inside? Do you tighten up? Do your ears turn red? Does your blood start to boil? Do you say things that you later regret, especially if someone's sitting around you and listening to you? What do you do in those situations? What about when a coworker at work gets a promotion that you expected to have? Maybe you thought you're the right person for it. You've been there longer. You qualified, but someone else gets that promotion. How do you respond in that situation? Not just to your employer, but to that individual. Maybe you're not asked to join a ministry team that's going on at church, and you've been here a whole lot longer than others that were asked to be on this ministry team. And you think you're the person for it, but for whatever reason you weren't asked. How do you respond in that situation? Or maybe some of you you want something for a present, and you've been voicing that, and your parents give that present to your sibling, to a brother or a sister instead of to you. Or maybe you're wanting to date someone, wanting to go out with someone, and that person, you're really looking forward to, man, I just want to ask, and all of a sudden you find out that person goes out with someone else, even worse, goes out with a friend of yours. How do you respond in those situations? Those are the things that we're talking about here. How do you deal with everyday life? There's more real life scenarios I could throw at you, but the truth is, as I was reading through those, I bet many of you were thinking of scenarios in your own life where when your buttons are being pushed. When people are pushing the buttons that would cause you to whine or to complain or to grumble, to argue. How would you respond in those situations? And I want to challenge you to think about your response before it's needed. Create your own anti-grumbling plan. Think about those times in your past when someone's done something that's caused you to grumble, and already think about how you'll respond to that, so that when it happens, you're prepared to respond differently, the way Christ would respond. Now, I recognize this isn't easy. Um, I recognize that and I believe it. But here's the thing. If you look, I want to challenge you to really think about what God is asking us to do in these verses. He's asking us to take on the same attitude as Jesus. Now this is real easy to just listen to this Bible study, let it play on here for the next couple of minutes before it ends, and to push stop and to go on about your way. But I want to challenge you to push pause. And I want you to pause the video and really think about how would you do this? How do you really take on this difficult task that the Apostle Paul is challenging us to do, and to take on the attitude as Christ, the same attitude as Jesus had? How do you stop grumbling and whining and complaining? And what would, don't just ask what would Jesus do. This is more than a bracelet or a catchy phrase, from way back when. This is really, how would you respond in a way that would give God glory in those situations? So what can you and I do to practice the humility that Paul is talking about in these verses, and actually place the needs of others in front of ourselves? Maybe it's just as simple as, once we begin coming back to church and churches open back up, maybe it's just as simple as parking in the farthest spot, in the worst spot of the church parking lot, not taking the best parking spot. Maybe that's where we start. Maybe you just arrive early to help your Sunday school teacher set up for the room, or to set up, or maybe you stay late and help them tear down, depending on the situation. It could be a lot of things. Maybe some of you are ready to not just take baby steps. Those I would think were baby steps. We're going to park in the last parking spot. Yeah, that's great. Let others park closer. But maybe some of us are ready to take deeper steps, or move a little bit quicker on this path. Maybe you can volunteer in a ministry in your town around, maybe a homeless ministry. Actually get in and put others first before yourselves. Maybe some of us can need to confess a need that we have, or confess our need for the gospel itself. Maybe that's where some of you are. Maybe some of us are really ready for some very big steps, like offering an apology to somebody that's hurt us deeply. Not waiting for them to come and say, I'm sorry for hurting you, but maybe us going to them first, and letting them know that I forgive you before you've even asked me for forgiveness. Maybe some of us need to share a desire to be forgiven like that. Maybe someone needs to, maybe God would place on your heart to meet someone's need, a monetary need, a financial need that someone else has. And you are blessed, and God's provided, and He's given this to you. Maybe that's a need that you could meet anonymously, not looking for any pat on the back, or not looking for anyone to even know about it. There's a lot of different ways that you can meet the needs of others, in your home, in your workplace, here at church. And that's what God is asking us to do. He's calling us to do. A major point of today's lesson is to place ourselves last. Place others before ourselves. And that's something that God and the Apostle Paul is challenging you and I to do this morning. Would you pray with me? God, thank you for your instructions on how we are to humble ourselves, and thank you for Jesus for modeling for us how to put others first. Father, I pray that you would create in us a healthy, Christ-like attitude so that we can have healthy relationships. We love you, Jesus. All these things we ask in your name. Amen. You guys have a great morning.